Hello, my name is Abby Ingram, and I will be presenting an overview of gender dysphoria based on the DSM-5. To start, let's go over a few definitions that are important to understand when discussing gender dysphoria. First is gender. That is the publicly lived role of a boy, girl, male, or female. Gender assignment is the gender that was assigned at birth based on external biological features. Gender identity is a person's social identification as a male, female, and occasionally other identification. We would call this the expressed or the experienced gender. So, bringing us to gender dysphoria and its definition. So, in general terms, it is a person's cognitive disconnect to the assigned gender. The effect of that disconnect can result in distress due to the feeling of disconnectedness between the assigned gender and the expressed gender. There are different diagnostic criteria for children and adolescents and adults. So we'll go ahead and we'll start with the children. So Section A states that a marked difference between the expressed gender and assigned gender for at least 6 months, and it must include six of the following criteria for diagnosis: a deep desire or strong insistence that they are the other gender; in boys preferring to cross dress or simulate female clothing; and in girls preferring to dress masculine and resisting to dress feminine; preferring cross gender roles when playing make believe or engaging in fantasy play; preferring toys, games, and activities stereotypically of their opposite assigned gender; preferring playmates of the opposite gender; in boys, rejection of masculine toys, games, and activities, as well as avoidance of rough and tumble play; in girls, rejecting typically feminine toys, games, and activities; a deep dislike of their sexual anatomy; and a deep desire for sexual characteristics to match one's expressed or experienced gender. Section B of that criteria is this condition is associated, it must be associated with clinically significant impairment in social, school, or other important areas of functioning to have a gender dysphoria diagnosis. You will also have to specify whether it includes one of the following disorders of sex development: congenital adrenal hyperplasia or androgen insensity syndrome, and those would need to be coded together. Gender dysphoria in adolescents and adults. Section A of the criteria is a marked incongruence between the expressed gender and assigned gender for at least 6 months in duration and is manifested by at least two of the following criteria: a marked incongruence between the expressed gender and the assigned gender primary and or secondary sex characteristics. In young adolescents, this could be the anticipated sex characteristics to come through puberty. As strong desire to be rid of the primary or secondary sex characteristics due to the incongruence between expressed and assigned gender. In young adolescents, desire to prevent the development of primary, secondary sex characteristics. A deep desire for sex characteristics to be of the other gender, a deep desire to be of the other gender, a deep desire to be treated as the other gender, and a strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender. Section B, in order to get a diagnosis of gender dysmorphia, which must also be met, is that the condition is associated with clinically significant distress or impairment in school, occupational, and other important areas of functioning. Also comes along with the possible specifying whether it's also associated with a disorder of sex development similar to children. Those are the same: the congenital adrenal hyperplasia and androgen insensitivity syndrome. Also, we'll need to specify if the person is post-transition and living as the desired gender and has undergone at least one cross-sex medical procedure or treatment. If there is a post-transition specifier, it may be in the context of continuing treatment procedures to support the gender reassignment. Although the associated features to support a diagnosis vary among age groups and gender, the marked incongruence between the assigned gender and the desired or expressed gender must also impede day-to-day functioning, causing distress in order to be diagnosed. Gender criteria for gender disorder varies among age groups. Children are defined in a concrete and behavioral manner more than adolescents and adults. Young children are less likely than older children and adolescents and adults to express persistent anatomic dysphoria. In adults and adolescents, the incongruence between experienced gender and assigned gender is the main point for diagnosis. Factors related to distress and impairment vary with age as well. There's also functional consequences to a diagnosis of gender dysphoria that include failure to develop age-appropriate same-sex relationships, harassment and bullying, preoccupation with cross-gender wishes, stigmatization, discrimination, and victimization, a negative self-concept, economic marginalization, and other mental health risks. Differential diagnosis, so nonconformity to gender roles. Gender dysphoria must be distinguished from a person who chooses to not conform to stereotypical gender roles. The clinical diagnosis would need to include extreme distress and impairment, and not just someone who chooses to live a nonconformist way to gender roles. Transvestic disorder is occasionally associated with gender dysphoria, but mostly occurs in heterosexual and bisexual males who are sexually excited by cross-dressing, but not questioning their biologically assigned gender. For a diagnosis of transvestic disorder and gender dysmorphia, the clinical diagnosis would need to include the extreme distress and impairment discussed in the criteria. Body dysmorphic disorder focuses on the removal or change of a specific body part, which may actually have nothing to do with their assigned gender. Again, the clinical diagnosis would need to be developed and include distress and impairment related to the gender assignment. The final differential diagnosis would be other clinical presentations. So people with emasculation desire who develop an alternative non-male, non-female gender identity do have a presentation that meets the criteria for gender dysphoria. And the comorbidities. So for children with gender dysphoria, show elevated level of emotional and behavioral problems. The most common being anxiety, disruptive and impulse control, and depressive disorder. Autism spectrum disorder is more prevalent among clinically referred children with gender dysphoria than in the general population. Clinically referred adolescents tend to have comorbidities of anxiety and depressive disorders, which are the most common. Clinically referred adults may have coexisting mental health problems, again, most commonly anxiety and depressive disorders. That concludes my overview of the DSM-5 for gender dysphoria. I hope that I was able to provide you with some information on how to but how to give a reliable diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Thank you, everyone.